Welcome everyone to the ISPP virtual seminar series. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Rashmi Nair. Rashmi is an assistant professor at Ashoka University, India. Before joining Ashoka, Dr. Nair worked at the US Congress through a competitively awarded fellowship, dually supported by the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Nair received a PhD in social psychology from Clark University, USA, and master's in clinical psychology from Christ University in India. Dr. Nair's research focuses on experiences of group-based victimization based on various social identities, such as caste, religion, and nationality, and examines the implications of people's beliefs linked with these experiences for intergroup relations and policy outcomes. And her work is sort of unique in that aspect, given almost the lack of presence of social psychologists and political psychologists in the Indian policy sphere. So in studying this, she has employed both qualitative and quantitative methodologies and worked with historically disadvantaged communities, both in India and internationally. Dr. Nair's research has received funding support from various scientific societies, including the APA, Society for Psychological Study of Social Issues, and the International Peace Research Association Foundation. I hand over the floor to Dr. Nair, and just a few bits for housekeeping while we do this. If you have questions, please type them out, and we will take them after Dr. Nair's presentation. Thank you. Rashmi, over to you.
Can you see my screen? Yeah? Okay, excellent. One second. Something is off. Yeah. Okay, excellent. Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be here. And thank you, Raki, for that introduction. I'll just dive straight in. So broadly speaking, the social psychological research on intergroup relations has focused on improving relations between members of majority group and members of minority or oppressed groups. In contrast, little remains known about social psychological factors that may shape solidarity versus tensions between members of oppressed groups. So in my talk today, I'll be presenting results from two studies that aim to shed light on this understudied topic. Importantly, in doing so, I took an intersectional approach. Specifically, I examined beliefs linked with people's intersecting identities that can shape relations between two oppressed groups, Dalits and Muslims, in the Indian context. Okay, I want to begin by giving you a broad overview of the research on relations between oppressed groups. Broadly speaking, the scarce research on relations between minority groups has drawn on the social identity tradition. On the one hand, researchers have pointed out different kinds of threats that can come into play and shape relations between oppressed groups. One such threat is that of distinctiveness threat. This is where minority group members may be driven to differentiate their group from other oppressed groups. These beliefs or this distinctiveness threat can shape negative intergroup outcomes. On the other hand, researchers have drawn on the common in-group identity model, and they have argued that perceived similarity can help improve relations between oppressed groups. So for example, Craig and Richardson found that, Asian Americans who read about discrimination against their own community perceived greater similarity and expressed more positive attitudes towards African Americans in the US. More recently, moreover, Social psychologists have highlighted the role of processes that are linked with collective victimization. And these are presumably very important to study when we are examining relations between oppressed groups. So what is collective victimization? Collective victimization involves the use of violence against members of a community due to their social identity. It can include experiences of both structural as well as direct violence. Structural violence can include, for instance, experiences of discrimination, and direct violence can include experiences of physical attacks during riots. Social psychologists are particularly interested in how people think about these objective events of victimization. And these are called collective victim beliefs or collective victimhood. These are basically people's subjective perceptions regarding the objective victimization that has been committed against their community. The most studied kind of collective victim belief is that of comparative victim beliefs. It basically involves the ways in which people compare what has happened to their group and what has happened to other groups. Yeah, the suffering of their groups and comparing it with the suffering of other groups. Research on comparative victim beliefs has broadly highlighted two sets of processes. One that highlight differences between the experiences that have been faced by different communities, and the second set of processes that can highlight commonalities between them. We'll begin with the beliefs of difference. One such belief that can highlight differences in the experiences of communities is that of competitive victimhood. And this is when some members of oppressed groups may argue that their group has suffered more than another group. In other words, they engage in quantitative comparisons between the groups and argue that the in-group has suffered more than the out-group. These beliefs of competitive victimhood have been linked with negative intergroup outcomes in a variety of contexts, including Chile and Northern Ireland. Another belief that can highlight differences between communities is that of beliefs of uniqueness. So this is when members of oppressed groups may focus on the distinct aspects of the suffering of the suffering endured by their group when comparing it to other groups. Existing studies, however, that look into these beliefs of uniqueness, they've actually combined the measures that tap into this along with the measures on competitive victimhood. And generally speaking, there's far more research on competitive victimhood as compared to beliefs of uniqueness. However, these beliefs that highlight differences in the experience of different communities, they may not be inevitable. Research finds that some members of minority groups actually perceive similarity in what their group has gone through and what another group has gone through. These beliefs, called inclusive victim beliefs, have been shown to predict positive intergroup outcomes in a variety of contexts, including India, Israel, and the US. Yet, there are some important gaps in this research on comparative victim beliefs. First, much of this research has used quantitative methods, which tends to give more importance to the ways in which researchers operationalize a particular construct or the constructs that the researchers want to focus on, right? So basically, we don't know the ways in which members of these communities themselves think about their group suffering, compare their group suffering to that of other groups. A second gap in the research on comparative victim beliefs is that it has taken what one can call a singular approach, wherein researchers focus on single identity groups such as race, class, or gender in their analyses. The intersectionality framework was put forth precisely as an antidote to these singular approaches. And intersectionality scholars argued that it was important to account for the advantages and disadvantages associated with multiple intersecting identities that can shape our experiences. So basically, they argued that it was important to account for the impact of race, class, and gender. Although intersectionality has its roots in women's studies, it has traveled to many other disciplines, including psychologists. And recently, some researchers in psychology have drawn on the tenets of intersectionality and linked it with psychological processes. One such psychological process is that of intersectional consciousness, which refers to people's awareness of social advantages and disadvantages that are associated with multiple intersecting identities. Here's an item from a study that was conducted by Greenwood on intersectional consciousness. It says, understanding the life experiences of women from different ethnic groups helps us achieve our goals. So here we can see that, within the experiences, amongst the experiences of women, the item is tapping into the fact that, the experiences of women are not all the same. It can differ based on their ethnic identity. Yeah. So basically, intersectional consciousness, it can, in other words, one can say that it involves an awareness of within group differences that are stemming from intersecting identity. In contrast to intersectional consciousness, the concept of singular consciousness was proposed. And this involves when people claim that one identity is more important than another in impacting their lives. So basically giving primacy to the impact of one identity over another and overlooking the differences that may be stemming from intersecting identities. So for example, here's a sample item. Poor women experience sexism in the same way as middle-class women. So here we can see intersectional consciousness basically involves giving primacy to the identity of gender and overlooking the intersectional differences that are stemming out of class. So the focus is on similarity in the experiences of all members in a community. Now here I'd like to just halt a bit and make some points in relation to intersectional consciousness and singular consciousness, which will be helpful for later on. In relation to singular consciousness, although it's been defined as perceived similarity based on a shared identity, really the operationalization of this concept seems to focus on sameness. For example, this is the item that I showed you. Poor women experience sexism in ways that are the same as middle-class women. Yeah. Second, in relation to intersectional consciousness, because the focus of intersectional consciousness research has been on samples that have been predominantly white women, the idea of white privilege is key to its conceptualization. And third, regarding both these concepts of intersectional consciousness and singular consciousness, they both involve a comparison between groups that share a common identity. For example, poor women and middle-class women share their gender identity. Yeah, and therefore, intersectionality can be used to study both intra-group relations and inter-group relations. In other words, one can study relations within a group of women, and it's also possible to study relations between women from different backgrounds. Yet, there are some gaps in the research on intersectional consciousness and singular consciousness. First, because the research on intersectional consciousness has focused so much on, or rather, it involves a focus on white privilege in its conceptualization due to its focus on largely white samples of largely white women, perceptions of disadvantages that are linked with intersecting identities are not known. Second, these studies have tended to take a quantitative approach. So again, we don't know how people think about their experiences linked with these intersecting identities. And thirdly, this research has focused on Western contexts. And little remains known about how people think about their intersecting identities or the experiences linked with their intersecting identities in the global South. So addressing these gaps in my research, I employ qualitative methods to examine advantages, to examine how group members think about advantages as well as disadvantages linked with their intersecting identity in the understudied context of India. Just to give you an overview of the Indian context, the vast majority of the Indian population is composed of the Hindu community. Hindus form about 80% of India's population. Yet, far from being homogeneous, Hindus are divided by the caste system. The caste system privileges those who are considered to be upper caste, while disadvantages those who are considered to be lower caste, particularly those who are considered to fall outside the caste system, who are called Dalits. More specifically, members of the Dalit community are tied to occupations that are linked with sanitation work, leather tanning, manual labor, etc. And they also face practices of untouchability, which is legitimized by the caste system. To address this historical marginalization, the Indian Constitution mandates what they call reservations or affirmative action rights that basically set aside a certain share of positions in government educational institutions and public sector employment for members of the Dalit community. Dalits form about 16% of India's population. Another disadvantaged community in the Indian context is that of Muslims, who form about 15% of India's population. They are discriminated both in the public and private sphere, and owing to historical hostilities with the Hindu majority, Muslims have faced recurrent communal riots over the years. In some of these riots, moreover, Dalits were instigated by upper caste organizations. They were mobilized by them as foot soldiers to attack Muslims on their behalf. Moreover, although the vast majority of Indian Muslims are actually lower caste converts into Islam, who had converted to escape the caste system, they are largely denied access to affirmative action rights. Furthermore, in recent years, the situation of these communities has worsened. For instance, there has been a sharp spike in instances of mob lynching that is faced by members of both these communities. But against this bleak backdrop, there has also been calls for solidarity between these communities to counter the oppression that they are facing. Importantly, there have also been appeals between members of these communities from different intersectional locations, like between Dalit women and Muslim women. Yet, little remains known about victim beliefs that are linked with intersecting identities that can shape relations between these communities. So as a first step, I conducted a pilot study amongst Dalits and Muslims living in New Delhi, which is the capital of India. And amongst other issues, I asked them about comparisons of victimization of their community and that of the other. In terms of findings, really, the findings were twofold findings. The first set of findings are in relation to the methodological aspects. I found that members of Dalits and Muslims from low-income backgrounds were actually far more comfortable speaking to me in focus group discussions, presumably because focus group discussions can help us reduce the power difference between the researcher and the participants. Second, I also found that it was easier to reach middle-class Dalits and Muslims and upper middle-class Dalits and Muslims as well through individual interviews, given their work schedule. The second set of findings are in relation to the topic that I was interested in, which is victim beliefs. And I found that indeed people thought that the comparative victim beliefs were relevant to their situation. And they also mentioned the role of gender and class in shaping relations between these communities. So drawing on this pilot study, I asked, how do Dalits and Muslims compare their experiences linked with intersecting identities of gender and class? And how may these beliefs shape solidarity versus tensions between them? So in the main study that I conducted, I designed a two-part main study. Study 1 focused on middle-class Dalits and Muslims, both men and women. And amongst this group, I used individual interviews. Study 2 focused on Dalits and Muslims, both men and women from low-income backgrounds. And amongst this group, I used focus group discussions. Both these studies were conducted in New Delhi. As part of study 1, I conducted 33 individual interviews, and the participants tended to be highly educated, and they were working as government officials, lawyers, accountants, etc. As part of study 2, I conducted 12 focus group discussions, and these participants tended to have rather low levels of education, and they were working largely in the unorganized sector. They were working as, for example, daily wage workers or domestic helpers. During the interview, amongst other questions, I asked them to compare the experiences linked with their intersecting identities. Here's a sample question. Do you think the issues that Dalit women face are similar to the issues that Muslim women have to deal with in India? Or do you think the experiences of Dalit women are different from what Muslim women experience? These interviews and focus group discussions were transcribed, and then they were analyzed using a combination of inductive and deductive thematic analyses. Because there were substantial overlaps in the themes that I found in study 1 and study 2, I combined the findings for these studies, and that's what I'll be presenting in the following. Broadly speaking, the analyses revealed that participants were indeed aware of the impact of multiple identities in shaping their experiences. Further, I identified 5 ways in which people articulated their beliefs linked with their intersecting identities when comparing the experiences of Dalits and Muslims. To begin with, I will share the beliefs that highlight differences between these communities, as this is how intersectional consciousness has traditionally been defined. And then I'll present beliefs that are linked with commonality. So in line with past research on intersectional consciousness, some people expressed an awareness of intersectional difference in terms of intersectional privilege. For example, when asked to compare the experiences of Muslim women and Dalit women, a Muslim woman said, in comparison with Muslim women, Dalit women have to suffer more. They have to suffer more on the basis of caste discrimination. Because you know that it is said about them that they don't maintain cleanliness. The Dalit women don't maintain personal hygiene, that she is dirty. These things are not applicable to Muslim women. So here we see that this Muslim woman is arguing that Muslim women are better off than Dalit women, and in doing so, she expresses a sense of intersectional privilege. Building on past research on intersectional consciousness that has tested these beliefs amongst white women, these beliefs of intersectional privilege may predict positive intergroup outcomes. Now, in contrast to these beliefs of intersectional privilege, some people expressed intersectional consciousness in terms of competitive victimhood. In other words, they argued that their intersection was worse off than another intersection. So for example, when asked to compare the experiences of Dalits and Muslims from low-income backgrounds, a Muslim woman from low-income background said, lower-income Dalits get support from the government. All the cleaning jobs are theirs and they have quota. She's referring to reservation rights or affirmative action rights here, which Muslims are denied. We don't even get the work to clean the streets and they get to take home salaries. What about us? So here we see that, this Muslim woman is arguing that, low-income Muslim communities are actually worse off than low-income Dalit communities. And in doing so, she expresses a sense of competitive victimhood related to her intersecting identities. Although there isn't research on competitive victimhood in relation to intersecting identities, there is research on competitive victimhood from a single identity perspective, which links these beliefs to negative intergroup outcomes, and presumably competitive victim beliefs that are linked with intersecting identities may also be linked with similar destructive outcomes for intergroup relations. Third, I found that some participants highlighted qualitative differences in the experiences of these communities. So as opposed to saying that their group was better off or worse off, which includes quantitative comparisons, some members argued that there were qualitative differences in the experiences of these communities. So while also acknowledging the suffering of both groups. So for example, when comparing the experiences of middle-class Dalits and middle-class Muslims, a middle-class Dalit man said, they are different. Middle-class Dalits still experience untouchability, being a Dalit. But if someone is a middle-class Muslim, they'll not have this experience. They'll have different types of problems. Like if they wear a prayer cap or a beard, then people look at them strangely. But that's a different issue. So here we can see this participant is not necessarily engaging in upward or downward comparison, but really looking at the unique suffering that's undergone by both communities. While little remains known about these perceptions, one can draw on the broader scholarship on intersectionality. It is possible that these beliefs of qualitative differences linked with intersecting identities may entail positive intergroup outcomes for these communities because they entail an acknowledgement of suffering of both communities. So just to summarize the beliefs of intersectional differences that we have seen so far, participants experienced intersectional differences in three ways. They expressed it in terms of intersectional privilege or intersectional competitive victimhood and intersectional qualitative differences. Along with this, some participants also expressed beliefs of commonality. Now, although, singular consciousness has been defined as, perceived similarity based on the shared identity, this definition is actually at odds with the broader research on intersectionality, which argues that intersectionality has the potential to highlight similarities across groups that were initially thought to be different. In other words, the idea of similarity has been linked with intersectionality and with singular consciousness, which are supposed to be the opposite. So to resolve this, I drew a distinction between similarity and sameness. While expressions of similarity in intersectional experiences that did not minimize or overlook intersectional differences were coded as intersectional inclusive victim beliefs. Beliefs of sameness, which overlooked or minimized these intersectional differences, were coded as singular consciousness. So to give an example of intersectional inclusive victim beliefs, when asked to compare the experiences of Dalit women and Muslim women, a middle-class Dalit woman said, see, both their problems will be more similar. First of all, we live in a patriarchal society, okay? Being a woman, women have more problems. On top of it, if she's a Dalit or Muslim, there are more difficulties. So I feel that our problems are very similar. There are differences, like they should get reservation benefit or affirmative action rights, yeah, as is given to Dalits. So here we see that this Dalit woman argues that there's similarity between the experiences of Dalit women and Muslim women. At the same time, we see that along with these beliefs of similarity, this participant also acknowledges that there are differences between these communities, that Dalit women are better off because they have access to affirmative action rights as compared to the members of the Muslim community. So this illustrates that beliefs of similarity and differences are actually not mutually exclusive. And this was indeed the case in many other interviews as well. So these kind of responses were coded as inclusive victim beliefs, intersectional inclusive victim beliefs. Although there's no research on intersectional inclusive victim beliefs, one can draw on the broader research on inclusive victim beliefs from a single identity perspective, which have been linked with positive intergroup outcomes. Presumably, these beliefs of inclusive victimhood linked with intersecting identities may also entail similar positive outcomes. And finally, some participants expressed sameness when comparing intersectional experiences. For example, when asked to compare the experiences of middle-class Dalits and middle-class Muslims, a middle-class Muslim man said, they are the same. They are absolutely the same. There are no jobs. The job opportunities are limited. Even if a Muslim and a Dalit become an engineer, if he applies for a government job and if he is not getting job in the government and he fails to get a job in the private sector, then he is getting back to his previous work, what his forefathers were doing. So here we see this participant is arguing that there is no difference between middle-class Dalits or middle-class Muslims, and he tends to overlook these the differences between them and claims that they are actually essentially the same. These beliefs of sameness have been linked with negative intergroup outcomes. So just to summarize overall what I found 5 beliefs linked with intersecting identities. While some of them may predict positive intergroup outcomes, others may be linked with negative intergroup outcomes. Importantly, these beliefs linked with intersecting identities can serve as additional sources of tension and solidarity between minorities, along with victim beliefs that are linked with single identity groups. These findings also have some important practical implications, particularly for policymakers and for political leaders who are trying to forge solidarity between these groups. First, a more obvious one, policymakers can adopt a more intersectional lens to account for the advantages and disadvantages linked with intersecting identities when framing policies. So they can frame policies that are better able to attend to multiple sources of disadvantage that people may face. Second, political leaders who are aiming to forge solidarity between these groups, they should refrain from claiming that one form of disadvantage, deserves more attention than another. For example, gender is more important to take care of as compared to caste-based inequalities. These claims of one being, one source of discrimination being more important than another source of discrimination, they tend to overlook the ways in which they can be interlinked with each other, and they can jointly impact the lives of minority groups. And at the same time, they tend to pit one minority group against another. So it's important to refrain from these claims of one source of disadvantage being more important than another. And finally, when policymakers are using expressions of inclusive victim beliefs or beliefs of similarity, when policymakers are claiming similarity between these communities, they should be careful not to overstate these similarities, not to claim sameness in the experience. And in fact, they should be careful to acknowledge the differences as well in the experiences of these communities. There is research that suggests that disregarding these differences in the experiences of communities and overemphasizing similarities can backfire. This research has also some important theoretical contributions that it's made. First, it integrates research on victim beliefs with research on intersectional consciousness in the context of relations between oppressed groups. In doing so, when I say we, I really mean me and my collaborator, but we draw we do some redefinitions, in fact. So instead of equating, we argue that instead of equating intersectional consciousness with difference, it's better to have a broader understanding of intersectional consciousness, wherein it includes both beliefs of difference and similarity. Likewise, in terms of singular consciousness, which has previously been linked with the idea of similarity, we argue it's better to have a narrower definition here, a more specific definition here, where intersectional consciousness is defined as beliefs of sameness in intersectional experiences that underplay intersectional differences. Along with this, more broadly, we also extend the research on intersectional consciousness by highlighting beliefs of disadvantages that are linked with intersecting identities, going beyond the usual categories of race and gender, which is typically what has been studied in the fields of intersectionality, and examining this amongst underrepresented minorities in an under-researched context. With that, I'll stop there. Thank you so much for your attention. If you'd like to read more, much more in detail, this is a paper that I've written with my collaborator, where you can find a lot more detail about the study. But of course, I'm more than happy to take your questions as well. Thank you again for your attention.